HR welcomed me back from cancer treatment at 9. By noon, I found the permanent role replacing me, and its posting date showed the plan started before I left. It went live 3 days after I told the company my cancer treatment would require medical leave, and weeks before they promised that my job would be waiting when I returned. They would later insist it was a new position. They would say the timing meant nothing. And for a few hours, I almost believed them. Then I found the sentence near the bottom of the listing. One line about uninterrupted availability that had never appeared in any version of my job before I got sick. That line did not prove everything, but it told me where to look. Before cancer, I did not think of my job as something anyone would need to protect. I thought performance protected it. I worked in operations for a large regional business, not glamorous operations, the kind nobody notices when it works, and everybody screams about when it fails. Orders moved through one system. Customer escalations moved through another. Finance had its own process. Sales had a spreadsheet that seemed to reproduce every time someone clicked Save As. My job was to make those pieces behave like one company. When a shipment froze, I knew which approval had failed. When a dashboard showed impossible numbers, I knew where the duplicate records were hiding. When a senior manager promised a client something our system could not technically do, I was usually the person asked to make it happen before anyone admitted the promise had been impossible. I was not the loudest person in the room. I was the person the loudest people called afterward. For years, my reviews were steady. Strong delivery, reliable judgment, deep operational knowledge. I trained new hires. I documented processes nobody else wanted to document. I created an emergency playbook after a weekend outage exposed how much the department depended on information stored in individual people's heads. My manager praised that playbook in front of the leadership team. "This is what continuity looks like," he said. I remember that sentence because months later, the company used the word continuity in the title of the role it claimed had nothing to do with replacing me. At the time, though, I trusted him. Then came the appointments, the tests, the careful voice from the specialist, telling me the result was cancer, and explaining a treatment plan that made the next several months feel both terrifying and strangely administrative. There were forms for the hospital, forms for insurance, forms for work, and behind all of them was the same question: how much of my ordinary life would still be there when treatment ended? I told my manager first. I did not give him every medical detail. I told him what he needed to know. I had cancer, treatment would affect my schedule, and my medical team expected me to need a period away from work. His face changed immediately. He said the right things. "Take care of yourself. We will handle the work. Your job will be here." HR joined the next call. They explained leave paperwork, medical certification, benefits, and the process for returning. I asked the question that mattered most to me. Am I coming back to my position? The HR representative said the company would follow its obligations and its leave policy. Then she softened her voice and added, "The team is not moving on without you." That was not a legal guarantee, but it felt like a human one. Before I left, I spent days making the department less dependent on me. I updated the playbook, I recorded training sessions, I assigned temporary owners to recurring tasks, I created a single-page map showing what broke first when each system went down. My manager called it exceptional professionalism. I called it the only way I could enter treatment without imagining the office collapsing behind me. My leave was approved. I shut down my laptop. And for the first time since the diagnosis, I allowed work to become smaller than staying alive. Treatment reduced life to simple measurements: the distance from the bed to the kitchen, the number of hours before nausea eased, the energy required to answer one message, the strange victory of eating something and keeping it down. I did not secretly work through leave. I did not log in to rescue the team. The whole point of the documents I had created was that they could function without calling me. My manager sent occasional check-ins, nothing demanding. A sentence about the team, A sentence about taking all the time I needed. Once, he wrote that the playbook had saved them again. I stored that message with the others, not because I expected a fight, but because when your life becomes a chain of appointments and approvals, you learn to keep records. That habit would matter more than I knew. When my doctor cleared me to return, it was not a declaration that everything had gone back to normal. I still had follow-up care. I still tired faster than before. My hair had begun to grow back, but my body did not yet feel like mine. I notified HR and requested a temporary modified schedule so I could attend medical appointments and rebuild stamina. They acknowledged the request and scheduled a return-to-work meeting for my first morning back. I expected paperwork. I did not expect my badge to hesitate at the door. The light flashed red once, then green. Inside, the office looked familiar in the way a childhood home looks familiar after someone else has moved into it. Same walls, same lights, different arrangement. Someone had removed my nameplate. My desk was clean except for a docking station and a stack of generic supplies. The framed team photograph I had left behind was inside a cabinet. Nobody knew whether to welcome me loudly or gently. A few people hugged me. A few looked toward my manager's office before approaching. The strangest moment came when a colleague asked if I was staying on with operations. Staying on? I had returned from approved medical leave, not applied for a guest pass. Before I could ask what she meant, my manager appeared and said HR was ready for us. The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. They welcomed me back. They praised my resilience. They said the department had evolved while I was away, and that leadership was reviewing how my responsibilities should be structured going forward. I asked whether I was returning to my role. My manager said, "Your title and pay remain unchanged today." Today? That one word was the only honest part of the answer. They assigned me to review old documentation, while another employee continued leading the live operational meetings I had run before leave. Then HR said my accommodation request was still under review. I left the room with a temporary desk, no active portfolio, and the sensation that everyone knew the ending except me. That evening, I searched the company's careers page. I told myself I was being paranoid. The colleague's question, the empty desk, the temporary assignment, all of it could have innocent explanations. Then I saw a position called Senior Operations Continuity Lead. The title was new. The job was not. Coordinate cross-functional incident response. Maintain operational playbooks. Own the escalation framework across finance, sales, and fulfillment. Train department leads on continuity procedures. Those were not merely responsibilities similar to mine. They followed the same order I had used in my performance review. Even the phrase single source of operational truth was there, a phrase my manager used to tease me about because I repeated it whenever someone created another spreadsheet. The listing reported to my manager. It required experience with the same systems. It described the same internal relationships, and it promised the new hire authority over the live operational meetings I had just been excluded from. I scrolled back to the top. Posted weeks earlier. I checked the date against my records. The requisition had appeared 3 days after I formally told HR that treatment would require leave. Not 3 days after I returned. Not after the department supposedly evolved. 3 days after my leave request. I took screenshots of the public page. I saved the URL and printed the page to PDF with the date and time. I did not download confidential company data. I did not access anyone else's account. I preserved what any member of the public could see and kept the records I was lawfully entitled to keep. Then I reached the final qualification. Must maintain uninterrupted availability during core business hours and work on site 5 days per week. Before cancer, my job had allowed hybrid work. So did my team. Core meetings had scheduled coverage. Nobody had ever described the role as requiring uninterrupted presence. Now, while my request for a temporary modified schedule was supposedly under review, my apparent replacement role treated the opposite condition as essential. That did not automatically make the listing illegal. Employers may define genuine essential functions. They may hire for expansion, they may plan coverage during leave, but if this was truly a new position, why had it copied my duties? If the on-site requirement had always been essential, why had I successfully done the job under a hybrid schedule before treatment? And if the department had only changed while I was away, how did the posting predate my departure? I closed the laptop. For the first time, I was no longer afraid that I was imagining the plan. I was afraid I had found it. The next morning, I asked my manager directly. I did not mention discrimination. I did not accuse him of replacing me. I sent the link and asked one question. How does this position differ from mine? He replied quickly. The role was for planned growth. It would support me. Leadership had approved additional headcount because my documentation proved the department needed more resilience. For 10 minutes, relief flooded through me. Support made sense. The team had needed it before I got sick. Maybe the listing copied my duties because the new hire would share them. Maybe the posting date was not a trap. Maybe returning from treatment had made every ordinary corporate ambiguity feel threatening. Then I asked when interviews would begin. He stopped replying. An hour later, HR invited me to another meeting. This time, the explanation changed. The position was not exactly growth. It was contingency capacity. Leadership had needed uninterrupted coverage while I was away. No final decision had been made about how the roles would interact. I asked why a contingency role was permanent. HR said the listing language was standard. I asked why it included my exact portfolio. My manager said operations roles naturally overlap. I asked whether I would resume the portfolio when my temporary medical restrictions ended. Nobody answered the question. Instead, HR said they wanted to be careful not to make commitments before completing the accommodation review. That sentence mattered. My medical request was being treated as the reason they could not confirm my job, while the listing created after that request advertised my job to someone who would not need the accommodation. Still, I knew what I had and what I did not have. I had suspicious timing. I had substantially matching duties. I had a changed explanation. I did not have proof of motive. And that distinction kept me from making the mistake they seemed to expect. An angry accusation they could recast as emotional instability. I thanked them for the clarification. Then I asked them to put it in writing. That afternoon, I spoke with an employment lawyer. She did not gasp when she saw the posting. She did not tell me I had won. She said something far more useful. A timestamp is a fact. Meaning comes from the timeline around it. She explained that under federal law, cancer can qualify as a disability, including cancer in remission or a history of cancer. Covered employers may have to consider reasonable accommodations such as leave, modified schedules, breaks, or other effective changes unless doing so would create undue hardship. She also explained that the law does not make a worker untouchable. A company may discipline, reorganize, lay off, or terminate for legitimate reasons that are not based on disability or protected leave. A posting date alone does not erase those possibilities. Then we discussed medical leave. Eligible workers under the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act may have up to 12 work weeks of unpaid job-protected leave in a 12-month period, continuation of group health coverage on the same terms, and restoration to the same or a virtually identical position on return. But eligibility depends on details: the employer, the work site, length of service, hours worked, and the reason for leave. State laws may provide different or greater protections. In my case, the records showed that the federal coverage requirements had been met and that the company had designated the leave accordingly. The lawyer gave me 3 instructions before I left, not a promise of an outcome. First, separate public information from confidential company material. Second, write down what happened while memory was fresh, without exaggeration. Third, let the company explain itself before assuming what the documents meant. If the role is truly additional, she said, their records should be consistent with that. That became the center of everything. Not whether the company had posted a job, whether its explanation could survive its own records. For the next several days, I did exactly what the company assigned me. I reviewed old documents. I updated minor procedures. I answered questions when asked. I arrived on time and kept every medical appointment within the temporary schedule I had requested. My performance was not the issue. Access was. My system permissions were gradually reduced. I was removed from an incident response channel. A meeting series I had created disappeared from my calendar. My colleague, the one who had asked whether I was staying, quietly told me candidates had already interviewed for the new role. I did not ask for screenshots. I told her not to send me anything confidential. The public listing was enough to ask legitimate questions. Then, HR scheduled a meeting titled Organizational Alignment. This one lasted 12 minutes. They said leadership had completed its review. My original position was being eliminated as part of a restructuring. The new continuity role was broader, they said, and required full-time on-site availability. Because I had not yet been selected for that role, the company was offering me a transition package. I asked when the restructuring decision had been made. HR said the organization had been evaluating it throughout my absence. I asked why the supposedly broader role had been posted before my leave began. Silence. My manager looked at HR. HR said requisition dates did not always reflect final organizational decisions. That was possible. So I asked whether the job board had refreshed an older posting. She said she did not know. I asked whether my old role would exist after I left. They repeated that it was being eliminated. Then I opened the printed listing and read the first 4 responsibilities, not allowed for drama, simply enough for everyone to recognize them. My manager said, those functions still need to be performed. Exactly. The title could disappear while the job continued. They handed me a severance agreement. It included a release of claims, confidentiality language, and a short review period. They encouraged me to sign so the payment would not be delayed. I did not argue. I did not sign. I said I would review it. As I stood to leave, HR told me they hoped the process would not become adversarial. I looked at the document, then at the job listing. I hope the timeline is accurate, I said. It was the only answer I gave. Once the appropriate administrative process began, the company had to organize its story. The letter did not accuse anyone of a crime. It did not demand a public apology. It identified the leave, the return, the accommodation request, the posting, the matching duties, the changed explanations, and the proposed elimination of my position. Then it asked the company to preserve relevant records. Through counsel, the parties later agreed to exchange key documents needed to evaluate the dispute. What followed was not a cinematic raid on a server room. It was slower. Emails, requisition records, draft job descriptions, calendar entries, notes showing who approved what and when. And the sequence mattered. The first draft of the new role had been created after my manager learned that I would need treatment-related leave. Its business justification did not describe growth. It described reducing dependency on a role affected by an uncertain return schedule. The document did not say cancer. It did not need to. The return schedule became uncertain because of treatment, and the company knew that. A later version replaced that phrase with operational continuity. Then the job was posted. The on-site requirement appeared in a subsequent draft, after HR received notice that I might need a temporary modified schedule when I returned. Again, none of those facts alone decided the legal question. A business may need continuity, it may need attendance, it may change roles, but the company's own records undermined the order of events it had given me. The role had not emerged because the department evolved during my absence. The drafting began before I left. It had not originally been justified as additional growth. The first justification focused on replacing dependency associated with my uncertain medical return. And the full-time on-site condition had not been documented as essential until after my anticipated accommodation entered the discussion. The posting date was no longer a lonely clue. It was the pin that held the entire timeline in place. This was the sentence I had promised at the beginning, the one near the bottom of the listing. Uninterrupted availability sounded neutral. The record showed when it was added. That timing gave the phrase a very different weight. The timestamp did not read anyone's mind. It stopped the company from moving the beginning of the plan to a more convenient date. The company's lawyers responded that no discriminatory decision had been made. They said managers sometimes use imperfect language in draft documents. They said continuity planning was legitimate. They said the new role had broader strategic responsibilities, and that my position would have been reviewed regardless of leave. Some of that could be true. That is what made the dispute real. The law does not punish a company merely because its documents are uncomfortable. The question is whether a legitimate reason actually drove the decision, or whether that reason was used to cover a decision based on disability, leave, or an accommodation request. So the evidence had to be tested, not celebrated. We compared the roles line by line. Most responsibilities were the same. The systems were the same. The manager was the same. The operational meetings were the same. The broader strategy amounted to 2 bullet points that had already been part of my annual objectives. The company then argued that I had not demonstrated the availability required for the new position. But my request was temporary. My medical documentation said I could perform the job with a modified schedule during recovery. Before treatment, the role had not required 5 on-site days. And nobody had engaged in a meaningful discussion about whether a different effective arrangement could work. The request had remained under review until the day my position was eliminated. Then came the most revealing shift. The company stopped calling the role additional headcount. It stopped calling it contingency capacity. It stopped calling it a post-leave restructuring. Now it was a legitimate modernization that had always been under consideration. 4 explanations. 1 posting date. Every time the explanation moved, the date stayed where it was. The case did not end in a courtroom. It reached mediation. There was no jury, no dramatic objection, no executive confessing that the plan had been illegal all along. There were 2 rooms, a neutral mediator, long silences, and people calculating risk. The company emphasized that business needs continued during my illness. We agreed. It said continuity planning was allowed. We agreed with that too. Then my lawyer asked the question the company had avoided since my first morning back. If this was an additional role created for growth, why was my original position eliminated when I returned? If it was a restructuring developed during my absence, why had drafting begun before the leave? If full-time on-site work had always been essential, where was that requirement before my accommodation request? And if the company would have made the same decision regardless of my cancer treatment, why did the earliest business justification focus on uncertainty around my return? Nobody answered all 4 questions with one consistent explanation. That did not make a verdict inevitable. It made settlement rational. The company first offered more money in exchange for a broad release and silence. I asked for terms that addressed the employment record, not just the bank transfer. Continuation of health coverage for an agreed period. Correction of the separation record so it did not imply performance failure. A neutral reference. Payment for lost compensation. Review of the accommodation process. Training for managers who handled medical leave. and written confirmation that medical information would be limited to those with a legitimate need to know. The final resolution was confidential. There was no public finding of liability, and no invented million-dollar figure. I did not return to the job. By then, the question was no longer whether I could force my way back into the building. It was whether I could leave without allowing their version of the story to become the official one. The agreement gave me that. The new role remained online for a while. Then the company rewrote it. The copied phrases disappeared. The absolute on-site language became a statement about availability during defined coverage periods. The duties were separated into actual categories instead of mirroring my old review. I do not know who ultimately took the position. That person was never my enemy. They had not designed the process. They had applied for a job. My manager stopped contacting me after the agreement. A few colleagues did not. One told me the department finally hired more than one person and distributed the work I had once carried alone. That detail gave me more peace than any fantasy of the office collapsing without me. The truth was never that I was irreplaceable. Nobody is. The truth was that replacing a worker is different from quietly engineering a worker's disadvantage around cancer treatment than pretending the plan began later. I found another position after recovery. In the first interview, I asked how the organization handled medical leave, cross-training, and temporary accommodations. Years earlier, I would have worried that those questions made me sound difficult. Now I understood that a healthy workplace does not depend on employees pretending they will never become human. People get sick. Parents need care. Bodies change. Work continues. Good systems prepare for those realities without turning the affected person into the problem. That was the irony the company missed. I had spent years building continuity, so no single employee's absence would endanger operations. They used the language of continuity to justify treating my absence as a threat. In the end, their process failed the test my own playbook would have required: clear ownership, consistent records, and an explanation that remained true under pressure. For a long time, I told myself the posting date exposed their plan. That is true, but incomplete. The date did not prove motive by itself. It did something quieter and more important. It protected sequence. Without it, the company could say the new role came after my return, after the accommodation review, after a neutral restructuring. The date showed that the plan had started earlier. The matching duties showed what the plan targeted. The draft justification showed what concern triggered it. The added availability language showed how my anticipated restriction became part of the design, and the shifting explanations showed why none of those facts could be dismissed in isolation. Documentation is not revenge. It is memory with a timestamp. It does not turn every unfair decision into an illegal one. It does not guarantee a lawsuit, a settlement, or a job. But when powerful people control the meeting, the titles, and the official language, records can stop them from controlling time itself. My cancer treatment changed my body. Returning changed the way I understood loyalty. The company had praised me when my reliability protected them. The real test came when I needed their process to protect me. It did not. So I stopped asking whether I had been loyal enough to deserve better. I asked whether their explanation matched the evidence. It never did. If you had opened that listing, what would have caught your attention first? The copied duties, the new availability requirement, or the posting date? Tell me in the comments, but please protect your privacy and do not post medical records, employer names, or confidential information. And if you value workplace stories where the outcome turns on evidence instead of shouting, subscribe for the next one. Because sometimes the sentence that changes everything is not the cruelest sentence in the meeting. It is the quiet line at the top of a page that proves when the story really began.